Good Tuesday morning, Ted. How you doing?
Doing all right, thanks. Good Tuesday to you too.
Yeah, it's a big day. I get my Solana mobile phone today. I'm pretty excited about it.
Ooh, that is
Yeah,
kind of cool, man.
it really
Actually,
is. I
that's way
mean,
cool.
yeah, people rip Solana, and have forever, right? There's a couple things that people don't like about it. It's heavily invested in by VCs. It had this stigma attached with FTX, but I think what you're going to see is over time as that all kind of fades into the past, what really matters is what are they building and what are they doing. And if you look at their ecosystem, I mean, they are just flat kicking ass. And so I'm excited to get this phone. And I think the real cool thing about this phone is it's got a hardware wallet built into it that is separated from the rest of the phone. And so I've got to get into it and really test it out and see. And I can show everybody on the stream once I get into it and figure it out. But I'm excited to get it, so it'll be cool. I'll take it to Consensus this week and hopefully learn some fun stuff. I'm sure other people there will have one, and I think this for crypto is a huge deal. To have a crypto specific phone with the ability to store your crypto in a way that prevents others from getting access to it. Meaning, even within the phone, it's separated from the rest of the phone, is my understanding. So pretty excited to get that and check that out.
Yeah, that the one thing I wanted to, or the thing you're helping re-illuminate inside the terrain inside the brain here is that, excuse me, as I choke to death. The point I was trying to spit out here, this idea, this concept of the secure element. If you're if you're not steeped in crypto or this idea of different types of storage, like and I'll use some concept. There's concept of a hot wallet and a cold wallet, for example. This idea of something that's or like in today's world right now, but as and we're like right on the verge. I think we're on the tipping point where more and more of like things make it onto these handheld devices. And exactly the point that you were illustrating is that on the Solana phone, you're going to have a separate part of the circuit board. That's the secure element, is the kind of the terminology for this thing that manages generating the private keys for your wallet, and it keeps those on a chip. Now you have to. I mean, there's a certain level of trust here, but there's also a certain level of risk that the folks making the phone, for example, take if they don't, if they're not like, for example, Foundation Devices makes a cold wallet that's a separate unit. It has its own dedicated circuit board, screen, etc. It's not internet connected. It's what's called air gapped, meaning the only
Yep.
way for it to pass information is using QR codes over the air. So it uses the camera to read some information in a completely secure way, meaning it never touches the internet and or another device directly, like via wired or wireless connection. Now, that's a really important concept that I think more and more people are going to start to understand. But circling back to the secure element thing being on the device itself, I think that's a really powerful concept in that it frees us. It like breaks the linkage from having to have a separate, like a secondary device. Assume that this is my phone, which it is, and this is my hardware wallet, which it is not, but assume it is, and the two can talk over the air. But if I don't have one and I need to spend funds, for example, then I have to go acquire that. But if the secure element's on the chip and it's able to sign transactions in a secure way that doesn't open yourself up for, or it doesn't become an attack vector, is what I'm trying to say, then that's great. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and it's like everything else. I'm not going to put my entire net worth on this phone, right? Over time, you trust it, you test it out, you trust it, you use it, and you become more comfortable with it. And so and I also am not comfortable, even though it's air gap and protected. I don't want to walk around with that in my pocket. Like there's different
That's a
ways,
good point.
and I don't think anybody will. By the way, I think it's just like your regular cash, right? Like you don't walk around with all the money you have in your wallet, right? Because you're subject to all kinds of different risks. You store some in banks, you store some in assets, you store, So this is the same concept. And I think as you enter a world where crypto becomes, spendable and used more, you'll see people carrying, $200, $300 on their phones to use at all times, right? And that's what we really need to get to for crypto mainstream adoption is the use and the participation in the economy with crypto assets. So I think this is a great step. I'm really excited to get it, and check it out. I'm not super tech savvy, but in crypto you have to be to a certain level, right? And so this is just another step in the journey for that. But with that being said, we can get back into the topics of the day. And before we do that, we can just take a quick look at the price action over the last 24 hours. Bitcoin essentially hasn't moved. Ethereum hasn't moved. We've been pretty flat over the last 24 hours. And we get into some of the news that's happened. And we found out last night that Coinbase is suing the SEC on the rule specific to digital assets. So this is encouraging, in my opinion, because the SEC has chosen to rule through enforcement instead of by policy, right? And so I think this is great to see a company like Coinbase, who is one of the giants in the industry, step up and say, hold on a second, guys. Like, this is ridiculous.
So check this out. You have a publicly traded entity that has had to jump through hoop after hoop after hoop after hoop. They've had to grease how many palms, in a manner of speaking? How much money have they had to spend to get to this point? And what's magical here is that you have Coinbase posturing publicly to ask the government again and again and again, please give us regulatory clarity. It's necessary. And then you have Gensler tying his shoelaces together and then trying to walk and run. And what I'm trying to say here is this interesting sequence of events is that you've had Coinbase has been doing all the right things, in my opinion. Okay, they file their paperwork on time from a publicly traded company standpoint. They file their paperwork. The most important thing is that if they weren't paying the fees and if they weren't pushing, or if they weren't spending in tandem with that in the right way, there would be a bigger problem for them. But the point is they're doing all of those things. One, two, you've got Gensler, who looks like my mind looks like a complete clown, because you have all this evidence of him in previous iterations of himself, talking about crypto and talking about utility, talking about this, making statements about what is and what is not a security when he was quote unquote teaching. Okay, and now he gets into this this appointed position, if I'm correct, and now is the statements and the words and the actions don't line up, and then more importantly, you have you have Gensler testifying and making a complete jerk of himself, unable to answer basic questions, and just getting absolutely raked over the coals. Not that I think that really matters so much for normies, but what's important is I think it gave the Binances, the Coinbases, and the Krakens of the world, who are trying to operate within the proper legal frameworks here in the U.S., because it's a great market. There's lots of opportunity on both sides of the transaction, quite frankly. What I'm trying to spit out here, though, is that now that Gensler has gotten the attention of Congress and they're proposing to legislate him out of the role, and you have Coinbase announcing they're going to go offshore with some things, and that's a big deal. You have Gemini saying the same thing, and hopefully Kraken's going to make a bold statement if they haven't already, and say we're going to pack our stuff and we're going to go outside the U.S. where it's actually more friendly, because you clowns in D.C. can't get your shit together. Pardon my language, but the point I'm trying to get to now is you have. I feel like Armstrong and Jesse Powell and the Winklevis and the CZs all need to capture this momentum, in my opinion, and they need to press. And I think Coinbase is doing exactly the right thing, because they have the ability to go offshore. They always have. You saw, we all saw what happened when FTX was able to get away with murder to the nth degree. Okay. And the SEC was nowhere to be found. The U.S. got the U.S. financial regulatory apparatus that's supposed to protect consumers was nowhere to be found. And now, if I'm if I want to start an exchange, you know what I want to do? I don't want to even bother to open in the U.S. because I'll have to play by all these rules and I'll still get treated poorly because of the politics. And that's what I'm trying to say here is that you have the big banking lobby who is threatened. They're fire hosing cash into the lobbying apparatus, and all they're doing, and people like the Elizabeth Warrens of the world and all the other crypto critics are happy to take their money and they're happy to run their mouths because they know how this is literally what they do. They're wizards in this political arena and at this task. And anyway, the point I'm trying to get down to, I think it's amazing that Coinbase is doing this. I think it opens up it sets precedent. It gives it. Look, if I were Jesse Powell, I'd be finding a way to open my own bank, go offshore, do all kinds of stuff, basically to give let my actions speak louder than any words, and then say, by the way, this is what we're doing, and you jerks can't get it together because for all the reasons that we already know that they can't get it together and won't get it together, and let the American public start to feel some pain, quite frankly, and let people feel the anger and the frustration watching like all this great tech go overseas or go offshore.
And truthfully, this speaks more to just crypto. If this is how the SEC is going to behave itself with crypto, this is how it behaves itself with everything, right? This isn't specific to crypto. This is a big problem, right? This is driving not just crypto offshore, but if you're some new tech that's looking to come to the United States, you're going to look at what they've done to crypto and say, hold on a second, why would I go to that war zone? Why would I do that to my employees? Why would I do that to my customers? Why would I even think about going to the United States and opening a business? This is a much broader issue than crypto. And so that's why I'm so encouraged to see these big companies step up. And I'm optimistic that, there will be a path to smart regulation, right? And because if there's not, all they're going to do is going to drive this innovation and this tech offshore. Now, does that mean that can segue great into the next kind of topic that we wanted to talk about? You've got Chamath over here saying that crypto is dead in the United States because of this SEC stuff. Now, granted, I've not had the chance to watch what he said, so maybe the context of what he said is different. I'm assuming what he's saying is because of the SEC, crypto's dead. I don't buy that. I don't think that's true. I think that there will always be a way, right? But I think it's serious enough to kind of mention this, that Chamath is one of those guys. He's a big time investor, made a ton of money, right? And I did see one outtake where they were grilling him because he's in that All In podcast, and they've got 3 other guys, and they're all founders, and Chamath hasn't been a founder of anything, and they were coming at him pretty hard. Which, look, it is what it is, right? That's the world we live in, and But that being said, he is somebody to pay attention to with this stuff. But I don't think crypto's dead in the United States. Ted, do you?
Short answer, no. But I wanted to share something really quick. I think it's hilarious. The way that you were describing Chamath getting raked over the coals. I mean, that's all like great theater and all, but the reality is that Chamath saw the promise and the potential payoff in Facebook before a lot of people.
And Bitcoin. He was early in Bitcoin. Yeah.
Yeah. So he doesn't have to. As Mark Cuban says, you only have to be right once. In this game, or in the game of business, okay, and he's been right a couple times, quite frankly, and he's got the bankroll and or more importantly, the bank statements to prove. Like at the end of the day, he made some really courageous, I'll call them borderline heroic bets. I was and so, quick tangent. I was reading something that Peter Thiel also early days Facebook. He basically, and like very early on, was like, in a nutshell, was like, I'm gonna write this check for 500,000, and he bought this. Like, I mean, to me that's a pretty big swing. How like 15 years ago or whenever it was. I mean, it's a pretty big swing today. But the point I'm trying to get to is that that was I try to imagine having the financial firepower to be able to like stroke these big checks and take these huge swings, knowing that, I'm only going to be right maybe 1 out of every 10. But they had the courage to do it. And I think what I'm trying to ultimately communicate is that I admire, or the thing that I admire is that they had the courage to stare like the absolute, like, just like they're standing over this abyss of uncertainty, and they're like, this is my thesis, and they stuck to it. Now, they could have been wrong, and I'm sure they've been wrong many more times. But the point I'm trying to get across is that they saw this, and I think it's worth listening to someone like Chamath. But I don't know that crypto is dead. I'll argue that there are people that there are just as many people for every one who say that it's dead here. There's probably 2 or 3 or 5 more that are like us that say absolutely not, man. Just because there's some idiot in Washington D.C. and every other city, there's all kinds of idiots in governments of all levels, and yet somehow we still manage to function as a nation, and still it's the best. Even though it is challenging, there's not a whole lot of other places in the world that are business friendly and human rights friendly, things like that. But that's changing too. That's another interesting thing that's happening. You've got places in Asia, Hong Kong, and what's it? Singapore? No, is it Singapore?
Singapore, yeah, you got
Yeah.
Singapore, you got Dubai. You got,
Dubai.
look, there is, and I can tell you, like, until I was 33, I never left the United States. Essentially, I went to Mexico, but when I travel the world, it is eye opening. There is so many beautiful places, so many smart people. Like, we tend to have a U.S. centric point of view, and it's because it's all most of us have ever known. But this innovation is global, and people forget this too. Like, and they still forget it constantly, especially in the U.S. People outside of the U.S. do not give a shit what's happening in the U.S. I mean, I can tell you, like, when the first place I went when I traveled was Croatia, okay, and I was there for a month, and it was in October of 2017, okay, and so this is Josh just getting off the plane, and in Europe for the first time, and kind of like still very much U.S. focused mind, and there for a week or two, and you start to talk to people, and I met some people, and I was asking them basically, do you follow what happens in the American news? And they said, we're aware of it, but like we have our own problems here. Like we don't necessarily care what you guys are doing. Like we've got politics here that we pay attention to, and it's like that everywhere in the world. And I can share that I always tell people the 2 things I learned traveling was that everybody all over the world is just like me and you. They just want to be happy. They want opportunity to raise their family and make income. Everyone. It doesn't matter if you're in Croatia, if you're in Kuala Lumpur, if you're in Argentina, Buenos Aires, Argentina. All of us are the exact same, right? And then the other thing is everybody hates their government. That is universal. Like, and so it absolutely is. And it was one thing that kind of like opened my eyes to like, okay, I kind of get it now. And so when you look at the rest of the world watching all this, they just they don't care. Like we've got serious issues in this country right now. And the fact that they're up there parading around talking about, crypto and making these, it's absurd, right? Now, that being said, it's also a good thing that the industry has grown to such a level that we're getting this attention, right? But, in my humble opinion, we've got bigger issues to work out, right? Like, they could take an approach it's not this kind of just throw shit against the wall and see what sticks and deal with it later, because this technology is very innovative. It's good for people. Like I don't know how much more we can like hammer on that like Bitcoin and crypto are essential for your financial sovereignty, right? Like you have to have some of this stuff in the world we live in today. Now, does that mean we know what's going to happen? Absolutely not, right? But it's the same thing as saying, 20 years ago, if we started a stream, Ted, you and I would probably be banging the table for gold and silver, saying the same thing. These people are nuts. They don't know what they're doing. We would have, like Peter Schiff. Poor Peter Schiff, he just missed Bitcoin. You ever read the book Malcolm Gladwell? I think it's Blink or one of these or Outliers or one of these books where he talks about Bill Gates and he talks about timing. if Bill Gates would have been born 5 years earlier, 5 years later, he wouldn't have been Bill Gates, right?
Yeah, I think
And
that's
so
Outliers.
Outliers, yeah, fantastic book. And I've always remembered that in the sense of the things we talk about. I mean, crypto, for somebody my age, that was, let me think, when Bitcoin came out in 2009, I would have been 30-ish. How long ago? No, I would have been in my late 20s. Okay, so I was making good money. Had I been, aware, I was born in the perfect time. Now I missed it, right? I missed the opportune time to get into Bitcoin, but that's okay, because what you learn as you get into this is you haven't missed it. The idea still exists, right? And the opportunity is still there. But a lot of this stuff is basically, timing, right? Like, and I think with Peter Schiff, I mean, he was born 20, 30 years too early, to be able to, he didn't grow up natively digital, right? Like when we grew up, my first relationships were on AIM, right? Like my money's always been digital, like in a bank, communities and games were played online. This is all in my brain. This is all just natural. But if you're 20, 30 years older, you didn't have that stuff. And you look at the internet and you go, what the hell is all this? This is crazy. There's no way this is going to work. And so the reason I say all that is, let's translate that to our politicians, who are all 70 and 80 years old. They did not grow up digitally native. They still, like, I had an old boss and he always made the joke, and I never thought it was funny, because I was like, I know he's joking, but he sounds like an idiot. He's like, I don't think the computer's going to be around in 20 years. And I'm like, all right, like, like, cool.
You sure that wasn't
like,
Paul Krugman that was like had a mustache on and a hat and funny glasses that was walking around your workplace?
know. Like, yeah, he could, probably read it, but like, it was just like, but that's the mentality that these people have, is like, I'm going to do things the way I do it. Everything else is stupid and worthless, right? And so these people that are in power, a big part of it, in my opinion, is look at how old they are, and I think as you get more younger people in there, we'll see, like, it's just an interesting way to think about this stuff, like, in that dynamic of how they view the world, and then looking at how the world actually is, and I'm sure that when we get to be 50, 60 years old, there'll be all kinds of stuff that we'll look at and say, this is crazy. But that's why, embracing the youth is such an important idea. And you always have to stay mentally young, right? And be able to adapt to these ideas, and a lot of people struggle with this with Bitcoin, and the idea that, yes, the world is changing. They know it's changing, but they can't work themselves out of their mental framework they've built of the world to embrace something that's new. And so a lot of times it's harder, or it's easier just to say, no, it's a scam, than to adjust your mental framework and do the work to kind of understand what this is, right? And I think a lot of people struggle with this.
Yeah, there's that saying, better the devil you know. Like, even if things are not great per se, people still understand concepts like, I get in my car, I drive to a bank branch, I can deposit my check, and like if somebody wrote me a check, for example, or I got my paycheck in the little white envelope and I have to open it up, endorse it, even though there's orders of magnitude, or there are ways to do this that are orders of magnitude faster, safer, more efficient, cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. This example is simply to illustrate this idea that sometimes, even though it's not fun or it doesn't make sense necessarily, if it's familiar, it's like this. There's a good saying I heard when I was young. It said familiarity breeds contempt. People are, and what I'm trying to illustrate with that saying is that even though there's contempt, the familiarity though is what keeps people like locked in a certain mental model, or like this framework for trying to understand, and more importantly, underneath all this is to deal with all of the uncertainties that we face on a daily, and sometimes like 1 minute to the next, even, or hour to hour in the same day. We might experience a whole range of emotion across the spectrum. A lot of it, though, tends to be, depending on who you are and your personality and where you are in life and like what kind of financial challenges. I mean, we all have financial challenges. I mean, it doesn't matter how much net worth you have. There's still going to be things for you to tackle and have to deal with. Period. So all I'm trying to say there is that there's this interesting shift that's happening with in this idea of crypto. And I can make the analogy when I was growing up, we got our first VCR. It was a Betamax. And I remember the Betamax tapes were of a certain size. You know, they were architected to a certain standard because it made it easy for third parties, manufacturers, and other participants in the free enterprise system to go out and compete in the marketplace, develop new products, and try to win consumers. Okay, period. So then VHS came along, and you wouldn't believe, just like today, you have Bitcoin maxis. Think of them as like the Betamaxes, and then you had the Ethereums of the world, the Ethereumites of the world that are like, no, VHS is better. It's a better design. The cassette is much more streamlined. You can record, how many channels now, blah, 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 blah. Oh, but they had to develop new machines to play the new tapes and do all this other stuff. And, now you could plug the TV in with the coax cable. Oh God, what's going on? Cats and dogs living together. We got this new standard or this new thing that came along. And then it got even worse when first CDs showed up on scene and then DVDs. But you see what I'm trying to illustrate here. There's these people that are like, even today, there are people that will rather die than listen to their music, the music they want to listen to, if it's not pressed on vinyl and they're playing it through a record player. Okay, so all I'm trying to say is that this struggle that we're witnessing here in our lifetimes is not new necessarily. Just the bits have changed, but it's difficult for people to rewire their thinking, and it can be very scary. And the thing that makes it even more challenging, although there's lots of things that are challenging, is that this is dealing with money. Mm-hmm. And this is probably one of the most like terrifying and confusing things that we as like regular schmoes on the street have to contend with. And I think a lot of people for a long time over the last 40, 50 years have been they've been really, whether they realize it or not, they've been really grateful, and maybe with me that's not the right word, or they've been hyper focused on the U.S. dollar here in the U.S. Okay, obviously, and there was no other, like, you didn't transact in anything else. People didn't even used to invest very much. This idea of like buying stocks is relatively new in the grand scheme. You used to be able to take your cash, put it in the bank account and earn like 14% or 10%.
Well, I mean, it goes back to this idea of timing, right? If you were a boomer and you were born in the golden days of the dollar, right? Like, things worked great for you. Like, going off the gold standard and then coming into your working career, that was just pure honey. Like, you hit the sweet spot. But now millennials, and if you look at the numbers, like half of millennials are afraid they'll never own a house. And millennials aren't in their 20s anymore, right? Like, but like they're getting to their mid to late 20s, right? I think I'm the oldest version of the millennial, right? And when you were a boomer going through your 20s and 30s, housing was there. You could afford it. You could get a job. You could work one job your whole life. You could own a house. The house would appreciate in value, but that was timing relative to the U.S. dollar, going off the gold standard, right? And the dollar in its current form has only been around for 100 years, maybe in its current form off the gold standard, only 50 years, right? So like, that's the interesting thing to think about too. And you struggle with this with the older generation because they look at millennials and Gen Z now and they don't understand, well, why don't you just go get a job? And why don't you just well, sure, that sounds great. I'll go get a job that pays me $20 an hour. Gas is $5 a gallon. My house costs $600,000. I pay real estate taxes on, most of them don't consider that, right? And so, if through no fault of your own, depending on when you were born, living in this dollar system is a very different world, for people that are in their 20s and 30s versus people that are in their 60s and 70s. And so, I think a lot of this innovation was done by necessity, and so that's where it gets frustrating watching these people in Congress in the United States that are in their 60s and 70s take this approach, because it doesn't work for the rest of us. And so, is crypto dead in the United States? Absolutely fucking not, right?
No, not at all.
This is something that we need as a generation to grow and protect our wealth, because the system that you built and designed is failing rapidly. There is no other way, like this is this is the way, right? From the Mandalorian, this is the way. And so I think there's going to be challenges. I think it might get really difficult. It might get really scary, but in the long run, this is computer code, right? This is speech, and if this is how we as a generation choose to store and build our wealth, there is a way, and so that's what, I think when I think about all this stuff and think about it in relation to all these other factors that, that every generation finds its own way. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now.
Yeah. Really important things you just said, by the way. The thing that I'm reminded of when I worked at the fund, there was one who shall remain nameless. She didn't have to work. Okay. Her ego was like the size of this building. Okay. And I can understand why, because they had they had everything. Okay. They didn't want for anything. And but this particular individual had a very strong opinion about the work ethic of the younger generation, and this person would say things like, if I had to start over today, I could go out and find a job like that, and I could make enough money to survive, and I could pay my bills. And it took me about a year of working with this in this context, in this environment, to finally get the stones to say, well, then why don't you do it? And of course she didn't. I literally looked in her face and was like, well, why don't you do it? And what I'm going with this is that I would challenge, I think it would be it would make, at a minimum, it would make for great reality TV if like Mark Cuban or Chamath or Peter Thiel like got dressed up into disguise and went through this process of getting an entry-level job. And at the same time, they had to find an apartment, and they could in no way for, say, 6 months or a year, let's go crazy here. If we're in fantasy land, let's just go hog wild. Let's say for 12 months, they can't touch their financial resources that they have access to. They can't fly on their jets anywhere. They have to give back the Amex Black with no credit limit. And somebody else is going to take over. And so it's like when you become president, you have to put all your assets in a blind trust, and you're not allowed to know what's going on because you're president. So you avoid conflict of interest, all that stuff. I think imagine what it would be like. A camera crew follows Peter Thiel or Chamath around in disguise for a whole year, trying to make it as a newbie in the workforce, having to find a place to live, pay for an apartment, get transportation, pay for groceries, utilities, and all of these things, and see how hard and how easy, like people's work ethic, blah blah blah. Now, what I think would be interesting though is that these folks have the work ethic part down. They did, and they probably still do. You see what I mean? But I used to laugh to myself when I would hear the things that would come out of this woman's mouth about how people just blah blah blah. They're just lazy and they don't have any initiative. And I was at an age where I was still trying to figure things out, and I was barely, in the grand scheme, I was barely getting by. I only had like $300 or $400 every month that was left over after paying for everything. And to make it even worse, I owned a house that was being rented. Thank God I had a tenant in it, because I would have been screwed. This is not financial advice either, by the way. I had to pay for rent until we bought a house. So I actually owned 2 houses at one time, and I worked 2 jobs. I had my full-time job and a side gig. My now wife was working at the same time, and we somehow still managed, and not because we're like the smartest, the sharpest knives in the drawers. And I mean, I got an IQ barely above sea level in some days of the week. And all I'm trying to say is that it was incredibly difficult not to contend with all of the uncertainty, all of the every employer is different, but at the end of the day, the employers are always faced with making decisions around like what they can afford to pay for and what their risk is and all this stuff. And I had to contend with being, laid off occasionally when things got tough. There's these little economic cycles that affect businesses. And anyway, not that the hedge fund bit was going to really suffer, but the reality is that not every hedge fund makes it, and some of them go belly up real quick, and it gets ugly. But thankfully, that never happened. All I'm trying to say is that if I had to start over today, I at least would have some experience to lean on. But I try to put myself in other people's shoes, and if you don't have the experience, or you don't have the experiences that other people had. And it's really easy for people to say through the lenses of their own perceptual filters, blah, blah, blah. It's so easy. You guys are so lazy, blah, blah, blah. There's so many jobs out there. Yeah. Ask people that get laid off and spend 6 months applying to 700 or 800 jobs and getting nothing back.
Well, it was like our conversation the other day. I told you, you have this revelation that I've got an amazing set of skills that nobody's going to pay me anything for, right? They're only specific to me. Right, and my ability to generate income and wealth for myself. And so even if you have a skill set, it's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to get a job. But this idea of starting over, I think, is flawed in one key way. Starting over means you don't get the experience you had. Truly starting over means, all right, Mark Cuban, you're 20 years old, it's 2023, you don't know anything you do. And what would he do, Ted? What do you think? What industry do you think Mark Cuban would be in?
This is where the rubber meets the road in this idea. It's a really important concept. I'm glad you brought it up because you can't unlearn certain things. You just can't. Short of the Men in Black thing, it's near I would call it impossible to.
Well, yeah, but the point is, he would 100% be in crypto, and he would be pounding the table saying, "This is crazy. These people are doing this. This is absurd." And so, when you came through an old system and you were successful in it, right? And this isn't, I'm not talking about Mark Cuban specifically, just in general. And it's been very good to you and you've made millions of dollars and, you don't see anything wrong with it. You are naturally going to say, what is all this garbage? We don't need this, these people are just, these kids are just lazy. They don't want to go out and actually work. Well, they fail to understand the amount of work that goes into understanding this asset, right? And being able to articulate thoughts and then making your, investments through your thesis, right? And so this isn't something that's people are lazy. I think most people do want to work. But when they run their options through and they look at what their options are, they make the decision that's best for them long term. Now, that being said, there are times if you got a family, you got to go do whatever you got to do, right? That's our responsibility. You drive Uber, you do whatever, you get a job you hate, but you do it, right? And so I think there's different levels to this conversation, but in general, I think it's important to always remember these different factors when we think about this stuff. And to this day, I'll give you another example. When I was traveling, I was in Japan. Now, I might have talked about this before, and I gave a speech about being a digital nomad. And there was this bar we went to, and there's a kid. He was probably in his 20s. He was a bartender, and he came to the speech the next night. And then we got to talking, and I said, do you in Japan want the same things that we have in the West, as far as capitalism and entrepreneurship? He said, Josh, yes, absolutely, we would love that. He goes, the issue we have is that in Japan, the young generation wants to be entrepreneurs and capitalists, but we respect our elders too much that we can't criticize their decisions. And so you have this culture where they literally won't, because out of respect for their elders, criticize and do things. And so I looked at, you have to remember that in the rest of the world, even though it's awesome, in the United States, we're still able to do these things in a way that a lot of other places can't. And another story the same way, in Croatia, met a guy that owned a beer distillery, very successful, but he said his own parents wouldn't come to the beer distillery, even though they supported him, even though they loved him, because they were still in the communist mindset, right? And that you don't go start your own business. That's not what you do, right? That's not what we do. And America's unique in the fact that that is what we do, right? And it's still, a shining city on a hill. Now, some of the lights are out, right? Like, but we still are, a bastion of freedom and capitalism in the world. And so I think that's very important to remember and embrace. Even as we go through some of this stuff, you're going to have people that attack this, and you're going to have in any new industry, right? But that's part of the journey, and that's what you just have to grind through. And so to circle back around to, again, is crypto dead in the United States? I don't think so. I really don't. Now, can they hurt it? Sure. I mean, can they slow it down? I don't, maybe, but it's like I always say, it's like trying to stop the wind. I mean, you can build as many walls as you want, but the wind's just going to keep moving. Like, it doesn't matter, so I don't know. I think that's a good place to kind of wrap it up for today. I think that was, very, at least for me, when we do this, I sometimes am able to articulate thoughts that I've had in my mind out of nowhere. So that was a fun one, I think.
Yeah. I'm glad to have been able to reach into history and pluck some nuggets of experience. I won't call them nuggets of wisdom. I'll just say the nuggets from previous experience. And maybe they're helpful, maybe they're not. But at a minimum, I hope that things like this illuminate the terrain a little bit and get people to be more curious and start to explore these concepts and look for the utility, look for the good, but also understand that there's always going to be detractors, and
Yeah,
check
and
check it
also,
against what they're saying and make your own decision. I mean, that's the beauty of being here in the U.S. is you get to decide largely what you think.
well, and this is where you have to build things, and this is where you have to say to yourself, like, I understand not every day is going to be easy in the face of everything coming out from the media and the government right now, you know. But that's life, right? And that's the things you have to deal with, and so you just go and you push forward, right? And so I think that's a good spot to wrap it up. So we will chat tomorrow, Ted. As always, do your own research. Nothing we say is financial or personal advice, really. I mean, you take it for what it's worth, but don't make any decisions based off anything we say without doing